Good morning. Welcome to the final part of our three-part virtual series, What EPA Brownfield Grantees Should Know, hosted by NJIT Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities. We started the series teaching you the do's and don'ts of procurement. Continue the series deep diving into the Davis-Bacon Act and Build America, Buy America. And now, we're bringing it all home to guide you through the process of grant management. As always, we're excited to have you all here, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to spend it with us. Whether you're a new grantee or just need a refresher on requirements, all are welcome. If you made it to parts 1 and 2, welcome back. For those I haven't met yet, my name is Burnham Ms, and I am the events coordinator here at NJIT's Center for Community Systems. It is my pleasure to introduce our expert for today, Laura Burnham. Ms. Burnham heads up BRS's Grant Management and Grant Writing Division. She brings more than 25 years of experience writing and managing federal, state, local government, and private foundation grants and proposals, shepherding grants through to closure, and serving as a liaison between the client, regulatory agencies, and other redevelopment stakeholders. Her nonprofit funding and management, creative placemaking, and economic development experience support her success accessing foundation and governmental funding, contributing to over $573.6 million in funding secured to date. She holds a Master in Science in Community and Regional Planning from Temple University and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Tennessee. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you today about the wonderful world of grant management and all the things that once you get a grant or that you need to do throughout the lifetime of your award. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll show you the agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about your cooperative agreement. What are the reporting requirements? How best to set up your grant management system so you don't go crazy throughout the lifetime of your grant. How to do payment requests. What happens if what you anticipated to happen doesn't really happen and you need to make some modification to your grant. And then also grant compliance. And we'll finish up with some Q&A as Fatima discussed earlier. Next slide. So your cooperative agreement is really the blueprint for your individual grant. And I just want to stress that a cooperative agreement can be specific to your project. It's not necessarily the same as another grant that you might have. If you have multiple EPA grants, you need to make sure that you're referring back to the cooperative agreement for the specific grant you're doing grant management for, because rules change. They do tweaks between different years and different types of grants. So it's important for you to read your cooperative agreement, review it regularly, and understand exactly what is required of you. In your cooperative agreement, you will see there are grant terms and conditions, and it includes some basic information on what you need to do as far as filing financial reports, submitting your progress reports, submitting reports about minority and women-owned business enterprises and your use of them throughout your contracting, procurement rules and regulations, environmental requirements, and if you have a coalition grant or an RLF grant, there will be something about subawards and how the requirements of your grant flow down to your subawardees and subrecipients. That gets a little complicated. We're not going to go too far deep into it, but I just wanted to make you aware that if you do have subawards, you need to make sure that you're paying attention to that requirement. Also in your cooperative agreement or related to your cooperative agreement is your work plan that you do once your award is made, and then you have a work plan that gets approved by EPA and what your project specific deliverables are. So you always want to be in touch with those. And also there will be your budget that is broken down by detail, by task, as well as by category. And you need to be able to track your budget in both ways. And we'll get a little more into that. The other thing that's in your cooperative agreement are your EPA contacts. And if we could go to the next slide. It's really important that you know who receives what communications. And the reason being is you cannot assume that EPA people talk to one another. So your project officer and the grant specialist and the regional mailbox and the finance center are really the four main places that you'll be communicating or submitting reports to. And what you need to understand is that they are not necessarily going to share information. So also, if you send a quarterly report to your grant specialist, you're not helping them. They don't want to see your quarterly reports. So sometimes you're gumming up the system for them. So it's important that you get the right report to the right people. This is sort of a basic setup. Again, your individual cooperative agreement may have something different, but I think it's important that that you understand what goes to who. This is one of the things that I struggled with when I first started doing grant management, because I thought everybody wanted to know everything, and then I was politely told, no, that's not the case. The other thing is when you get into things where there's a little bit of negotiation that's required, it's not just submitting a report. You always go to your project officer first and consult with them to make sure that they are giving you guidance on how, for instance, you're going to do a budget modification or a no-cost time extension. Talk to them first, and then when you're doing the actual submission, it goes to either your grant specialist and the regional mailbox. Next slide. The first thing that everybody will be doing and everyone will be doing will be quarterly reports. And these are technical reports that you will submit on a quarterly basis that tells EPA what's happening with your grant. So it'll include your outputs and outcomes. There'll be a summary of your budget, what expenditures you've made, what cost share you've contributed, if there's any program income. Again, that has to do specifically with an RLF grant, what your project schedule and your milestones are, where you are on that. You are asked to identify any problems or issues that you see coming up, and also to discuss if there's any discrepancies with your work plan and your budget. You should be meeting with your program officer, your project officer on at least a quarterly basis. So I would say these last 2 points, the problems and if there's any discrepancies, should be discussed with your project officer. Don't assume that they're going to read your report and pick up that you are having a problem from your report. That's something that really needs to be sort of discussed with them. There shouldn't be anything new on your quarterly report that your project officer doesn't already know. Excuse me. You're going to submit your quarterly reports either via email, particularly for people who have older grants. And now they are moving really towards having all quarterly reports done on acres, and we'll talk about that in a second. Your quarterly reports are due 30 days after each quarter. The fiscal year follows the federal fiscal year, which means the fiscal year begins on October 1. So your first report will be due 30 days after December 31, so in January. So you'll be doing reports in January, April, July, and October. Next slide. I just wanted to show you really quick what ACRES looks like. ACRES is an acronym for Assessment Cleanup and Redevelopment Exchange System. We just all call it ACRES. And as I said, EPA is transitioning all their quarterly reports to ACRES, and there's a login there. You just log in. It's one of the things you're going to need to set up when you first get your grant, is your own ACRES account. Each quarterly report is now tailored to the type of grant. So if you have an assessment grant or you have a cleanup grant, your quarterly report format will ask for different kinds of information. And it's important that that you log in and you see what the information is that's required. EPA has a lot of technical assistance and webinars and training on ACRES, so you definitely need to check it out. I think one of the things that's always been a challenge is a lot of times their technical assistance is about how you work the ACRES system and not as much guidance on what content they're looking for their answers. So they're getting better about sort of guiding grantees on what kind of information they're looking for. So it takes a little bit of time, so have patience. The other thing that's kind of new is that with every site that you're working on, you will be doing a property profile in acres, and you'll see there, in my case, this is my dashboard from acres. I have 102 properties that I'm reporting on. It'll be important for you to update your property profiles before you begin your quarterly reports, because now they are integrated. So when you get into your quarterly report, you will see that there's a section on the various sites you're working on, and those dates, like, you know, when cleanup began or when you turned in your QUAP or some, you know, all of those milestones, they are actually in your profile, your property profile, not in the quarterly report. So it'll be important for you to start with the property profile and then come back to your quarterly report to put in the rest of the information. Next slide. This is what they look like. You know, visuals on, you know, quarterly reports are not too exciting, but I thought it was important to sort of include some of these images just so when you see them, you'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I get what she's talking about. This is a quarterly report for an assessment grant, and this is a new format. EPA just did a webinar on this. I think they got halfway through the material, so I'm pretty sure they're going to have to do another one soon because there were a lot of questions about it. And you can see there where it says project process on the quarterly report, you'll see the tasks. The task 1, task 2, task 3, and then you're asked to report on what's happening against each of those tasks and how much money is spent on that task to date. Make sure you have the ability to edit these tasks. So make sure that you set up this quarterly report the way you want it to look at the very beginning. It's hard to change it halfway through. So make sure that the tasks match your work plan when you get started. These forms are still evolving. I'm sure EPA is going to be tweaking them as they go along. We just all have to go with that role. We have to flow with that. Next slide. Another report that we do on an annual basis normally is an FFR, which is a federal financial report. This is the SF 424 form that you would have also done with your grant application. It's pretty straightforward. We all have to do one annually. It matches the end of the federal fiscal year. They give you a whole quarter to get it done. I advise you to do it as soon as your fiscal year and your quarterly report for ending 9/30 are completed. It's pretty straightforward. You will also might probably be asked to do a federal, an FFR if you're doing a modification to your grant or a no-cost time extension. They'll ask you for an interim report. I always like to match my interim reports to the last quarterly report so we don't have funky numbers that we don't know where they came from. And then you will also do a final FFR 90 days after your grant is completed. The final FFR, when it gets submitted to the financial center, that cues EPA that your grant is closing and that it'll include your final reimbursement. Excuse me. What's going to be reported on them are, again, the federal funds that you've spent or I have requested, as well as the cost share, and if you have any program income, if you have an RLF. One of the tips that I just want to share is they update these federal forms on a regular basis. And if you're not using the most recent form, they will kick it back to you. So make sure you're using the one that's most recent, and you can get them on grants.gov. EPA also has them on their website. Next slide. This is sort of a detail of an FFR that you may or may not recognize. Again, make sure that when you're doing your annual FFR that you sync it up with your 9/30 quarterly report, and you'll see there that at the top where it says federal cash, A, B, and C, your cash on hand should always be 0. So what the A shows is the cash that you have requested from ASAP. You should always show that you have actually dispersed all that cash. You shouldn't be holding federal funds because that causes a whole bunch of issues if you were to do that. So we just don't do it. And then the other question I always get from people when they're filling out this form is the unliquidated obligations, which is that letter F. So letter E should again show everything that you have drawn down to date. And then the unliquidated obligations would be if you had any expenses that you were holding that you had not drawn down yet from EPA. I try to avoid that, but in some cases, if you have a large reimbursement that you haven't completed yet and you want to have that reported, you can certainly put that on line F. I just bring that, it's a silly detail, I know, but it's one that's always is something that people trip over when they're trying to fill out this form on the annual basis. Okay, next slide. Another form that you are required to do on an annual basis is what we call the MIBI-WIBI, which is the Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprise. EPA has, in fact, the federal government as a whole, but EPA in particular has an 8% goal for awarding contracts to disadvantaged business enterprises. So as a grantee, you're required to not only try to help EPA meet this goal, but also to report on it on an annual basis. So for any grant that's over $300,000, you're required to submit the EPA form 5700 every year, even if the answer is 0. Again, you have 30 days after the end of the fiscal year. So we are doing our MIBI-WIBI reports in October, and you will also do one at the final report. They are cumulative for each year. So the number goes up as opposed to a separate number each year. And the thing that's different about a MIBI-WIBI is that it is based on the contract amount of whatever contracts you've awarded that year, and you report the total contract amount, whether you have had any invoicing or not. So when you award any contract that's going to be paid by your EPA funds, you need to know whether the contractor is a MIBI-WIBI, and that contract needs to be reported to EPA. Next slide. So here's sort of a detail of the MIBI-WIBI report, obviously, and this is the core of it. And I just wanted to show you that this is very simple. This is a one-page report. This is really what you're reporting right here. These 3 boxes are the most important. If you haven't made any procurements within the year, you just click that top box and you move on. It's signed and it's submitted. If you've done procurement, they ask you, what your total procurement in that year was. And then the second line is how much of that was a MIBI-WIBI procurement that the firm was minority and women-owned business. In this example, they had procured 1 contract, and indeed that firm was a MIBI-WIBI, so the entire contract was reported as here. The other thing you're required, which is part of your Davis-Bacon, part of the language in your bid documents, you should include this the regulation about good faith efforts to show that procurements you try to engage minority and women-owned businesses in bidding on your projects. So there's a whole section that EPA has training on this, and also, but I think the main thing is if you include the language in your bid documents, you're covered. You can always say, yes, we have tried to implement the disadvantaged business enterprise regulation. So I hope that makes sense. Next slide. Okay, the other oddball requirements are your key contact form. If you did put in a key contact form with your application, if there are any changes to the key contacts you have 30 days to resubmit that form. And if you don't do this change, sometimes this will hold up a reimbursement. So it's important to keep EPA up to date on who your key contacts are. Also, there are some communications that only go to certain I think there are 3 or 4 key contacts on that form. There are certain communications that go to them, and it's important that you get that communication. So it's important to have your key contact form up to date. As I said a little bit earlier, you will be doing property profiles, forms on acres. Any site which is using EPA funding has to be entered into acres. And usually you put in not only the description of the site, but you're also entering any contracts that are used on that site. The numbers that go in there as far as your contract amount do not match what you would be reporting on your QR, right? So it's not your total grant amount. It's really just the contract that's specific to that site. So that's something that sometimes people get confused on. I only put in a property profile once I know a contract is awarded and then it's moving forward. The reason is often sites are approved for site eligibility, and then for one reason or another, work does not move forward. So don't get too anxious and put in a site just because it's been approved by EPA for site work. And the reason is once you put it in there, you have to report on it basically for life. So I try to not add a lot of extra sites where actually no EPA money ever will be used. So it's important to keep that in mind. Another example is that when you're doing a phase 1 on a site, the AAI form that's required with your phase 1 asks for a site ID number. When you enter a new site into the acres, it automatically gives you an EPA site ID number. So you will have to enter a site in order to complete your AAI form. You will be required to update any environmental or redevelopment information that happens on a site as work progresses, and in some cases post your grant. So it's important to keep it up to date. Certainly if you are ever applying for additional funds, or when you are closing out your grant, these are key times when you really need to have your property profiles up to date, because EPA does look at them and does want to make sure that they have the latest information. That information is public, and they actually use this information as well to create statistics on when they are going to Congress for funding. So it's important for them to for you to give a good faith effort in giving them as much information, particularly on the redevelopment end, which often happens after your EPA grant ends. So any kind of information on jobs created or leverage funds that were created by funding that came from from a developer or from other parties toward the redevelopment of the site, it's important to put it on your property profile. The final closeout obviously happens at the end of your grant. You have 120 days to put in your final report, 90 days for the financial part. So it's important that within 90 days, you've gathered your final invoices, you've done your final reimbursement and submitted it to ASAP. But you have an additional few days to finish your final report. Your project officer has some leeway on how they like to see their final reports. Some that in the past have just asked for the final quarterly report with an additional page about the deliverables and the milestones that were met over the lifetime of the grant. Some like a separate quarterly report for your final quarter and a final report in and of itself. So it's important to check with your project officer about how they like their final reports to look and what information they want in them. The final report, the technical report, is emailed to your project officer. It doesn't go anywhere else. They're the ones that do it. Your cooperative agreement, which is what that CA stands for, sorry about that, are listed in the, they do list all the requirements for your final closeout. Next slide. Sorry, I'm talking fast. I'm trying to get through these slides so we have plenty of time for questions. Setting up your grant management system is like the key thing that really you need to do to make sure to keep things going. First, when you get your award, make sure you set up your ACRES account. It requires a login.gov, and when you go to ACRES for the first time, it sends a message to your project officer to approve that you are indeed who you say you are. I just wanted to note that your login.gov is personal to you. You have to have an ID in order to get your own login.gov. It's not about your company. It's not about your who you work for. That login.gov will be yours wherever you go. So I just want to make you aware that some people are taken aback, and you have to give them all kinds of personal information, which is a little disarming. But that's the way the government set it up. And it actually, if you're managing grants for other agencies, your login.gov is the same. So it's kind of again, it's personal to you. The other thing I want to say about ACRES is they have a help desk that's actually quite helpful. They're lovely. You can ask them to open past reports. You can ask them if there's any technical issue, and they're really pretty responsive. So don't be afraid to contact the help desk. And when you go to a Brownfield conference, they always have sessions, and you get to meet the actual people who work the help desk. And it's very, it's a small world. It's lovely. The next thing you need to do is make sure you set up your ASAP account. This is the account where you would do your reimbursements. It's important to have a finance person who manages the ACH or your banking transactions to be most likely the person who would actually do the ASAP transaction. And there's all kinds of instructions and guidance. It's pretty simple. So that's important to get that set up so you can make sure you can start doing reimbursements. The other thing I want to say is make sure you keep your SAM.gov registration up to date. You're required to do this throughout your grant. And it's a real hassle if you let it expire. It's also challenging if the main point of contact changes, which happens often in government. So it's really important not to let it expire and have a change of person, because then it could take up to 6 months to get your SAM.gov registration back. So, and that can affect a lot of your federal grants. So make sure you do that. That's my little PA for today. My public service announcement. Next slide. This is the way I have my grants set up as a bunch of files. And it's important that you keep all of these things and be able to put your hands on all of them. So I have, a folder for my application so I can look back to see what I said to EPA about what I would do, a separate folder with my cooperative agreement and the approved work plan, again, so I can refer back to these guiding documents. I have a folder for each of my different types of reporting, quarterly reports, annual, the FFRs and the MEB-WEBs. I do a lot of financial tracking. I keep records of contracts. I keep records of all the invoices, and as well as budget tracking. I use, the easiest thing to do is to set up an Excel at the very minimum, so that you can keep track of all of your invoices and by task as well as by budget category. I also keep all of the drawdown reports, and I'm going to show you one in just a second, with the supporting documentation and any confirmations off it ASAP. And it's important once in a while to reconcile what ASAP says against your own financial tracking to make sure you're not missing something. The money should equal, right? If you put in so much money and requested so much money, your balances should be the same. We also need to track any changes to the award, if there's any budget modifications you submitted, any work plan changes, and no cost time extensions. It's also important to keep any information on contracts and subawards, any correspondence you've had with EPA. Anytime you get an approval from EPA, keep a copy of the email, just to be sure, so that you, if something comes up or like your project officer changes, you have documentation. I have a folder for all my site eligibility requests and broken down by the site, and then work products for each site, meaning the QAPs or phase ones or whatever planning that you're doing for each. So these, it looks like a lot, but it's important that if you break it down like this or similar to this, whatever your style is, you can put your hands on things. And I have had occasions where EPA has come back to me and asked me for, all of the past quarterly reports, or they've asked me for documents that we had submitted to them, and somehow they can't put their hands on them. So don't be surprised. Next slide. Payment requests. This goes back to ASAP, right? You've set up your ASAP account. The other thing that's important for you to talk about is what is your cash flow needs for your project? Because the frequency of your payment requests is really up to you. There's no requirement for doing reimbursement, and I'm going to caveat that in just a second. But if you don't have the money to pay your contractor, you might need to coordinate where you get an invoice from a contractor, you put in your ASAP. The transfer of funds is quite quick. I say 1 to 2 days. EPA will say within 24 hours, but I like to say 1 or 2 days. So where you'll do your reimbursement, you'll get the money, and then you can turn around and write a check to your contractor. Some organizations, particularly large governmental ones, they usually work on a reimbursement basis where they just pay up front. And once it gets through their system, which sometimes can take a couple months, you submit the invoice for reimbursement to EPA. So you really need to kind of talk about what works best for you. And sometimes it's a mishmash, right? Sometimes you do it on a reimbursement basis because it's a bunch of small invoices, and then you get a really big one, and you need the money right away. So you can do an individual reimbursement. Doesn't matter how much money you're asking for. You can do whatever works for you. EPA does use the drawdown funds, the funds that you draw down, as a proof of sufficient progress. So even though I said it doesn't matter, you need to make sure that you are making regular drawdowns so that EPA sees that you are moving forward in your project. A lot of times there are not a lot of drawdowns in the first year of a grant, but you need to definitely make sure you do at least one before the end of the first year. And then later, as your project kind of gets rolling, I like to actually do mine. And if there's no timetable for cash flow, I like to do mine in conjunction with my quarterly reports, because it's the same financial information. So that way they match, and I know that with each quarter I'm doing a drawdown. Again, I want to say, if you're drawing down funds in advance to pay your invoices, don't hold your federal funds. You're not allowed to hold your federal funds in an account for more than 5 days. There's a whole other system that you have to do, and you have to pay them interest, and you have to do all kinds of accounting. It's not worth it in my mind. So I would say just don't make it a practice. Next slide. Here's an example of a payment request that we use. This is not required by EPA, but we do this so that we have an exact report on what the drawdown is included, what is included in the drawdown, so that we have a record. And we attach the invoices. In this case, you'll see this drawdown request was for $27,000. We have a detail of what invoices were included, what the work was for, And we do this as a report for our clients. And so it's important, I think, that you have a record, even though, again, this is EPA doesn't really see this. We do send this report to our project officer for approval before payment. Again, that's important to get their approval and to keep a record that they approved it. So an example workflow for doing payment requests is to create a report like this and then attach all the invoices, have it reviewed internally with your own accounting, whoever, to make sure that it's all correct, submit it to your project officer for review, and then request the amount from ASAP, and then ask whoever is doing the ASAP drawdown to give you a confirmation. You can print down a confirmation of what you've just requested. And I like to keep those and make sure that they're, again, my budget balance equals what EPA says. Next slide. Sometimes grants don't go the way you anticipated. So EPA does allow you to sort of do a work plan or a budget modification. Again, you should be discussing these issues with your project officer and get their input and guidance up front. Minor changes can be approved by your project officer and do not have to go any further. If a budget modification is more than 10%, then you have to do a formal grant requirement. That can take some time. And the 10% threshold is cumulative over all requests. So you could ask for 2 or 3 small ones, but then once you hit that 10% threshold, it has to go through a more formal process. Hopefully that's not required, but sometimes it is. Same with no cost time extensions. We have found that you need to really start early. So, you should take the time at the beginning of the year to sort of take a look at where your grant is when you're particularly in the last 12 months of your grant. Take a look to see if you're going to be able to complete everything that is required. And if not, you should start talking about it and then making a new schedule. And then, in April for a September 30 expiration date, you should be making a no cost time extension. A formal request requires a written justification, and you have to put in a revised work plan schedule and do an interim FFR. So be prepared to provide, an explanation as why you need the extra time and how you're going to actually finish your project with the extra time that you're requesting. EPA is getting a little more stingy on these. Again, it's really important to talk to your project officer about what's happening with your project so that they will advocate on your behalf for any of these modifications. Next slide.
Yeah.
So it's important that you sort of understand that there are consequences to not managing your grant correctly. While EPA is there to help you and will do whatever they can, they do have some, lines that you can't cross. And some of the common issues that people do that lead them to non-compliance is they just don't do their reporting, or they don't submit the receipts, or their reports are late, or heaven forbid, they're drawing down money that's not based on actual expenses. Those are all very scary things to me as a grant manager. And the consequences can be that, EPA will either withhold your cash payments, ask you to repay what they've already paid you, which is very painful, disallowing future grants, suspending your current grant. I mean, I have not had a grant get to this point, and that's obviously not where I want to go. But it's just so that you understand that in some cases, EPA's hands are tied because they have to follow federal regulations. And the government is pretty strict about not doing your reporting correctly. I believe that's it. Next slide. There's a few references that I brought up earlier, and my understanding is these links will be made available to everybody. Here's about information on acres as well as ASAP. And I think that's it. Next slide. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, everybody. Hopefully I left enough time for questions.
Thank you, Laura. Like you said, we've gone ahead and shared those resource links in the chat if anyone is interested in reading further. Again, as I said before, this webinar will be recorded, so we'll post this presentation along with the recording on our website whenever it's available. All right, well, before we go into our Q&A session, I'm going to give folks a few moments to type in their questions in the Q&A window. Should anyone present today have any additional questions or comments after this webinar ends, feel free to utilize our post-webinar survey or connect with us on the NJIT TAB LinkedIn page. You may also visit our website at www.njit.edu/tab or other social media platforms to access more information, resources, and news. We would love to connect with you after today to see how we can assist you in your EPA Brownfield grantee journey. In fact, NJIT TAB can provide a multitude of services for communities in EPA regions 2 and 4. We serve as a free independent resource to state, territory, regional, county, tribal, and local government entities and nonprofits attempting to learn about, identify, assess, clean up, and redevelop brownfields. At NJIT TAB, we help through our Brownfields Academy, Brownfield Community Engagement and Educational Forums, and one-on-one technical assistance. Along with virtual webinars such as today, NJIT TAB can assist you with other virtual or in-person Brownfield Community Engagement and Educational Forums. From beginner-friendly Brownfield basics to more hands-on technical events such as, but not limited to, panel sessions, community workshops, and Breaking Brownfields, where we invite private sector representatives and experts to answer your project-specific questions. NJIT TAB can meet you wherever you are in the Brownfields process. We also provide one-on-one technical assistance where we offer tailored guidance for many Brownfield-related tasks and can answer any questions that you may have about your Brownfield project. If you'd like more information, we also host our Brownfields Academy on our website at www.njit.edu/tab. Yes, I'll repeat it again. Here you can find a wealth of information such as how-to videos, infographics, success stories, previously recorded webinars, news, upcoming events, and more. Lastly, NJIT TAB can provide support for grants. For those who haven't heard, the U.S. EPA has opened their solicitation period for 2025 ARC grants. These Brownfield grants include assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup grants. At NJIT TAB, we can assist with grant writing tips, answer questions about the grant process, and provide free reviews and recommendations of grant applications before submission. The submission deadline of November 14th will come fast, so feel free to get a head start by contacting NJIT TAB after this webinar. We'll also be hosting some grant writing workshops in the coming weeks, so feel free to keep listening or check out our website where we post information about all of our upcoming events. We could also host a grant writing workshop for your community. We can cater this workshop to your community's needs and targeted EPA Brownfield grant types. Contact NJIT TAB for more information. I mentioned something about upcoming events. Let's highlight a few today. On September 18th, NJIT TAB's Director of Environmental Services, Kaylin Burnham, will be in Quincy, Florida for Brownfields from Vacant to Vibrant. This interactive session will explore the opportunities that properties, referred to as brownfields, can contribute to economic development in Gadsden County. Attendees will learn the basics of identifying and cleaning up these sites, how to access resources, and perspectives on environmental justice and planning for a resilient future. On September 19th, Kaylin will also be at this year's Alabama Brownfields Conference. Here she'll speak about the narrative side to grant writing during her panel, Write Your Story, Crafting Your EPA Brownfield Grant Narrative. In addition, NJIT TAB will be hosting one of its dynamic sessions, Breaking Brownfields. In this interactive forum, a government entity or nonprofit presents their specific Brownfields redevelopment challenge to a panel of private sector experts, who then provide actionable feedback on overcoming those obstacles. If you're interested in presenting your own Brownfield-related challenges or lending your expertise to the panel, don't hesitate to reach out to NJIT TAB. Lastly, on September 24th through the 25th, NJIT TAB will be presenting 2 sessions at Brownfield Coalition of the Northeast Sustainable Communities Workshop. The first session, Tips and Strategies for EPA Grant Writing, Setting You Up for Success, will teach attendees the grant writing process and will provide practical tools and knowledge to set you up for success in securing EPA Brownfields funding. Second session, Mining Community Assets for Funding Success, Telling Your Data Story for Grant Writing, will teach attendees how to gather existing data on your community's demographics, health, welfare, and geography to put your brownfield challenges in context. Discover how to transform these statistics and attributes into an impactful story, highlighting your community's unique assets and challenges. For those that can't make it to our events or would like to access this webinar after today, we post recordings along with presentations and related resources and links on our website at www.njit.edu/webinars. Today, we've highlighted 3 for you that may complement your brownfield journey. In fact, we have parts 1 and 2 of our What EPA Brownfields Grantees Should Know series. So check those out if you haven't. Feel free to view those recordings after today's webinar or explore the NJIT TAB site to find a vast library of resources, links, and other informative videos. All right, with that information out of the way, let's start our Q&A session. Let's see if anyone has any questions. Okay, I think we have a shy group today. I think they're kind of still, it was a lot of information today. I think they want to kind of chew on it a little bit. Doesn't seem like we have any questions, but we could leave this open a little bit to see if you have any questions. Again, we also have our contact information here available. We posted it in the chat, and I also have it here on the slide. So feel free, if you don't get your question in today, you might want to chew on this information a little bit, kind of process it, how it relates to your grant. If you want to ask those questions, after today, feel free to ask this, feel free to reach out. So I'm not seeing any questions. That's okay.
Oh, one just came in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Oh, thank you. Amy, what documentation should you have in your file for personnel that is charged to the grant?
So you should have timesheets that show the time that is spent on the EPA project itself. And that takes many forms. It could come, it kind of depends on how each organization tracks their time. But what we normally have are a spreadsheet or a report on the individual's time and then the rate, their rate and their fringe rate, which likely might have been reported in their original grant application. And so when you are doing your reimbursements or your quarterly reports, that backup is provided to show the expense. I guess the bottom line is EPA does not have a specific form for personnel and fringe. It's kind of up to your what system you use.
I guess as long as you're showing the documentation, you're like accounting for it.
Right.
All right, I think we'll end it here, if that's okay with everyone. And with that, we thank you for spending some time with us today. We hope this web series has empowered you to confidently navigate your EPA Brownfield grant. We would also like to thank Jennifer Taylor, Alicia Flamia, who spoke during parts 1 and 2, and Laura Burnham for sharing their EPA Brownfield grant knowledge. Keep an eye out as we hope to create more content like this so that you may manage your community's brownfield redevelopment like a pro. Thank you, and you all have a great day.